So Climate Change Capital, I'll just give you some context of who we are and what exactly we do, because there are very different parts of investment and investment in clean tech and clean power. The fund I work for, Climate Change Capital Private Equity, is a €200 million fund focused on growth capital investments in clean tech, which includes clean power, energy efficiency, clean transport, waste and water. To date, we've invested in 10 companies in the sector. They are based all across Europe. There are 2 actually in Cambridge, and they are in the solar, energy efficiency and water sectors in particular. Clean tech is a very interesting investment sector right now. It became a very hot topic, particularly about 3 or 4 years ago, and is continuing to get real growth and interest in investment. There are some very large, as we all know, macroeconomic factors driving the need for investment in clean tech, which I don't need to go into in my presentation, but in particular climate change and resource scarcity are the 2 sort of big drivers. The focus of my fund and what we do is growth capital, which is typically later stage than pure venture capital. So we're looking for companies which have commercial revenue. They've demonstrated that their business has a market for their product. It's a big global market. They've got a management team which can grow a business, but they need that capital to actually grow. And that's the context of my job and where I particularly come from. So this slide is just sort of to stand in the background. So the investment in the private equity and clean tech, as you can see from the coloured bars here, has gone up and down, as you might expect, from quarter to quarter. But in general, particularly after the credit crunch drop in investment, is sort of growing around just under $2 billion of investment each quarter. The red is the venture capital, blue is private equity expansion. So we are sort of in between those 2. And actually, if you went down a level, you'd see the venture capital as a large chunk of late-stage venture capital. There's less interest from institutional investors these days in early-stage venture capital, because the time to realising the value of the investments is extending, given the capital-intensive nature of a lot of clean tech businesses. In addition to this type of venture capital type investing, there's a lot of money going into this sector. The big areas are M&A. So this is where companies such as Total, who have just bought SunPower, a large solar power manufacturer, Nordic Capital, which is a large buyout fund, have just bought a company called SIC Processing, which is a solar value chain business. In total, there's about $60 billion each year invested in M&A in clean tech. This is typically asset infrastructure type M&A, but it does include other sectors. But the real big investment, though, is into the asset finance. Something like $130 billion was invested last year in asset finance in clean power and clean tech, and that's where the real challenge is. So what my fund does is to help provide the businesses that can supply those sectors, but there's a whole wave of other money that needs to come in from large pension funds to actually make these things happen. So to make the wind farms happen, to make the solar parks happen, to make the smart grid happen, that money comes from elsewhere. We're about the companies that will benefit from that growth. Clean tech is quite a broad description. It's actually a cross-industry area. Clean power is, as I mentioned, one thing that we look at. I mean, the clear industry darling has been and continues to be solar power. Particularly from a venture capital private equity point of view, this clean power is a sector which is growing very dynamically. There are lots of interesting SME-type opportunities in the sector, and there are lots of positions in the value chain where you can get involved. I mean, one interesting statistic is that the top 5 solar cell manufacturers from 2003, when the market was about 500 megawatts, don't even feature in the top 10, I don't think, or maybe not even the top 20 of the top manufacturers today. So in 2003, the top 3 were, I think, Sharp, BP and Kyocera. Today it's companies like Suntech, First Solar and Qcells, who each have a capacity of well over a gigawatt and have come from pretty much nowhere by 2003 standards, and in 2011 and 2010 they are the industry dominant players. And for venture capital investment money, that kind of growth and industry change is what is interesting. I mean, the other sectors I think to note are transport. Clearly there's a big energy use in transport. The interest sort of earlier on in the cycle, 2007 and before, with biofuels. They had a bit of a torrid time with the US subsidies changing, and the emphasis there has diminished, although there is still sort of some very interesting development work going on in second generation biofuels, changing cellulosic crops into ethanol rather than just taking agricultural corn. But at the same time, the investment in electric vehicles has grown quite nicely, which is really the transport that is the bulk of the transportation area. What's difficult from my fund's point of view with transport is that it's competing against the likes of Ford, GM, Nissan, who not only have massive balance sheets, but they have massive unfair advantages in terms of large workforces and therefore other political influences that need to protect those jobs. And to have a start-up trying to get in there is very difficult. The industry darlings in that sector are Tesla and Fisker, who are challenging that status quo, but it's yet to be played out whether they will become global consumer brands or just some interesting companies that help develop that technology and get swallowed up when they go bust, or when they are successful and somebody buys them. Equally, there was a company called Modec, who you may have come across, which was a UK company that did EV light electrical vehicles, so multi-drop vans for Tesco's or for UPS. A very interesting company, a very interesting segment for electric vehicles, because the range anxiety wasn't a problem, but they just faced an adoption problem. They were a small company, and the likes of UPS and Tesco's would buy maybe 10 vans off them, but it wasn't enough to get their company going, and they went into administration earlier this year. And that's an example of where the UK has developed a very fantastic company, but it just didn't quite get there at the right stage. But I think the focus of today is really on clean power, so I'll talk less about the other sort of sectors and more about clean power now. I mean, what's driving all this is as the previous speaker was talking about, is the need to green the grid, get more of this of these new technologies, renewable technologies, generating power to replace the old fossil fuel technologies. And to do that, they need to be economic. It's a market. At the end of the day, in 50 years' time, if solar power is still up on the right end of this chart, we shouldn't be doing it. We've obviously got it wrong. But I think the expectation is things are moving left. So the interesting examples here, if you have a look on the left, you've got the approximate cost of grid energy around $50, $60. And that's where you can see the natural gas, CCGT and coal-fired. When you add on the cost of carbon capture, if that becomes a true market element, then the cost of those goes up quite substantially, and then actually you bring all these other technologies into play. But the two to notice today is landfill gas is already pretty much economic at grid prices, and that's why the subsidies on landfill gas have dropped from one rock to a quarter of a rock for new build. Wind onshore is pretty much there. The problem with wind is that, well, there are two things. Is that the price is unlikely to come down much more. It's heavy engineering. The companies in that sector are big established companies like Vestas, and you've got Goldwind in China, but at the end of the day, they're big lumps of steel with big lumps of fiberglass, which have to last 20 years as big fatigue machines, and you can't get too much more cost out of those. So unless energy prices come up, which will then push the cost of steel up. There's only so much you can make wind cheaper. You just have to put them in windier places to get the economics to work. But the economics are almost working, but the challenge they face is the intermittency of the wind and the fact that the wind doesn't necessarily blow when you want to. That's different for it being unpredictable, which people say it is, which is not. The wind is very predictable. You can know today that it's going to be windy tomorrow, which is plenty of notice for a grid. Unfortunately, the grid might go, well, you've got 20 gigawatts of wind coming on tomorrow. We can't turn off all the power stations completely because we might need them again that afternoon. And that's what's the problem. And then from a market point of view, you need to have that power being bought at a market price that makes it economic. 2 minutes. I need to hurry up a little bit. But the most exciting area for us really in here is PV. PV has rapidly moved from the far right of this chart. It's in the middle, and it's moving left at a high price. The price of solar panels is already down at €1 a watt, and rapidly decreasing. At this level, in some markets, Italy, California, it makes economic sense to put them on your domestic roof or your commercial roof to mitigate your energy bills. And that's what will grow a market rapidly. The other element of the impact of clean tech is the clean tech on the grid. So you've got these renewable generators, but what does that mean? So this is an example of what's happened in Germany. On a sunny day now in Germany, 10% of the power comes from solar power, which is great news. You're mitigating all this fossil fuel. But what you've done, if you look on the morning peak, you've now got a proper morning peak rather than a gentle shoulder. It's a peak, and then the afternoon peak is more peaky, and that comes back to the problem of demand management is one problem, but as we say, that's not going to solve it. You can't turn all the fridges off or fridges on or whatever it might be. You can't turn all industry off just because the sun's gone away or it's windy. So you need to have storage solutions or more peaking power, and peaking power is by definition expensive. But for those technologies to become a reality, you need market signals for the people to invest in there. So today, I think the National Grid spends around £250 million on, I think they call it reserve services, which are peaking power and various methods of storage, particularly pumped storage. And that has to increase for there to be a market for people to invest in batteries, storage solutions, peaking plants. Otherwise, it just won't happen. The main sort of coming back to general investing now. So what scares investors is uncertainty, policy uncertainty, technology uncertainty, revenue and profit uncertainty. The best example, I think, is what's happened in Spain. They had a fantastic boom of solar about 3 or 4 years ago. Enormous amount was installed, far much more than the government ever predicted. And now they've decided to retrospectively change those tariffs. And you have international institutional investors who've put very large amounts of asset finance into this segment who potentially will have to write off their investments. Which, okay, you think, well, that's very sad. All these bankers or financiers in the city who may lose their money. Well, okay, fine, but actually that just means that they won't believe governments in the future and they won't invest and things won't get done, and we'll be sitting here in 10 years' time and everybody will have sat on their hands because they don't want to invest. So policy uncertainty is a problem because ultimately until all those bars in the previous chart move the whole way to the left, you need some form of policy subsidy to make these things happen. Which sort of brings me to the summary of what our investment strategy is today. We tend to avoid companies exposed to single policies, single geographies, single markets. Investors, by definition, like to diversify what they're doing. We like to avoid technology risk in what we're doing. We're investing in the companies that have demonstrated their technology work, but they need to grow that into their market. We don't particularly like commodity price exposures. Our money's mobile, we can invest in other things. And less we're interested in companies exposed in markets and requiring subsidies. So from our clean tech point of view today, we're less interested in renewables, we're more interested in energy efficiency, we're more interested in waste recovery. We're more interested in water. But there are segments clearly within clean power which may be interested. So final slide is just an example of a few of our recent investment. The top two are two Cambridge-based companies, Enexis and Nudura. Enexis makes microinverters which go on small rooftop PV systems, which we feel is going to be the really interesting segment in PV. Nudura is a company which makes chips to make mobile phones more efficient and mobile phone networks more efficient, reducing energy demand. So that has nothing to do with clean power, but actually has everything to do with just saving money. We've just made two other investments, one in a water company that cleans wastewater, and water is a whole another area of clean tech which has less reliance on subsidies today. And heat pumps, this is more of a European investment. The UK is struggling with heat pumps and its renewable heat incentive, but in other countries heat pumps really make quite a lot of sense, particularly where there's less of a gas grid available. So that concludes my talk. I think I covered most areas, but feel free to ask some questions in a minute, because there are lots of areas that I didn't cover, and it's a massive, massive topic that I could probably talk all afternoon on, or morning even.